Hey, Sean McDowell here. I'm a full-time high school teacher where I teach my students how to wrestle with important theological issues, apologetics, and worldview. I've also written about 12 books and get a chance to speak in amazing places around the world. I want to welcome you to join me in a cross-examination, which was a recent conversation I had with skeptic Michael Shermer.
Yeah, I disagree with that.
Why? Why is morality not
it's transcendent of you and I as Americans. It's transcendent of us as Westerners. It's transcendent as us of living in the 21st century. We evolved certain moral emotions because we're social primate species and we have to get along. So there's an actual evolutionary logic to why committing violence against somebody else is not good. So it begins with something really simple. What's the difference between a rock and an animal? Animals hit back, rocks don't. So right away we have a calculation here of when I should aggress and when I shouldn't aggress, because there will be consequences for it. So much of our moral behavior evolved as a fact that we're a social primate species, and that we have to work together, stick together. We're going to hang together, or surely we will hang separately. This is the nature of a harsh environment. Now, it begins with something that sounds sort of calculating, like we call it reciprocity. So I'll do something nice for you, and you'll do something nice for me. Now, some people, well, that's just a cold calculation, not real morality. But the shift comes from the fact that it's not enough for me to pretend that I'm a nice guy and lure you into thinking I'm a good person, and then I stab you in the back. Because if I was actually like that, you'd eventually find out, or our fellow group members would find out, I'm not a trustworthy person. So it's not enough to pretend to be a moral person. You actually have to be a moral person. You have to live it, believe it, think it, and become it. So the Old Testament, for example, I think we can really understand it much better from an evolutionary perspective. Love thy neighbor. Who is thy neighbor? In the Old Testament, it really is your kin and kind in your immediate surrounding circle. Otherwise, it's perfectly okay to rape, pillage, and destroy those bastards on the other side of the river because they're not one of us. So one of the forward movements of the New Testament was to say, okay, we can do better than that. We can do better than the Old Testament.
Okay. Let me jump in here if I can. We can come back to specific Old Testament and New Testament ethics and debate whether it's better or not.
You have to be squirming when you think about the Old Testament. All the murder and rape.
I don't.
And Yahweh endorses rape and pillage and
he doesn't
killing
endorse
firstborns.
Here's the interesting thing.
Keep the women alive so he can rape them. This is what Yahweh endorses in the Old Testament.
If you're critiquing the Old Testament, you're borrowing from the theistic system to do it. Because you're assuming that humans have value, that humans shouldn't be treated that way. I don't see where that comes from an evolutionary model.
How do you explain that?
You're assuming that there's
stories?
Free will and human beings shouldn't freely act and treat others that way, which an evolutionary explanation cannot do that. So you're right, these are difficult ethical issues that have to be worked out. But the only reason that you think they're a problem is because there's objective moral value in human beings. And there's a way humans are supposed to act.
And you know what the foundation of that is?
But I haven't heard yet how.
You know what the foundation of that is?
Let me answer. Because what you said a minute ago, you said evolution is the responsibility of this. Now, is the cause of this. Now, you remember at the beginning we talked about how there's objective morality, which is like gravity, which is a part of the universe we live in.
Yep.
Subjective morality is internal to people. It's the subject. Now, if evolution caused this, and people get together and I go, well, reciprocity, I have to treat you another way, then this is moral values coming from within a human person. So you can create up morals however somebody wants to. I'm not bound to any law outside of me. It becomes a subjective morality. So I guess my challenge would be is that you're mentioning objective moral values, but the justification you give is actually a subjective justification. I think it's ultimately relativism. Because you're right, some behavior does aid in survival. Some behavior, right, if I really act like I'm moral, maybe in certain settings I'll be more likely to survive. Maybe, that's something that's possible. But it doesn't answer the question why I should even care about the survival of the species unless you can show that internally they have some kind of value within themselves. And in an accidental atheistic universe, where we popped into existence from
Okay,
nothing
it's
and
not
there's no
not an
plan.
accidental universe.
Sure
There's a definite progress and logic to why we behave the way we do. So think of it this way. So we have certain emotions that drive behavior. This is what emotions do. So you're hungry, that we know exactly the hypothalamus releases certain hormones. You feel hungry, you seek calories. We have to propagate the species, so you have certain feelings about members of the opposite sex. You find certain things attractive. You don't have to do the calculations of waist to hip ratio and facial symmetry and all the things we find attractive that we've now sort of quantified. You don't have to do the calculations. Sure. Evolution's done the calculations for you. You just have the feeling like, wow, I really think you're hot, right? So
Thank you,
those are very.
Sorry,
I'm not on that team, but anyway, not that there's anything wrong with that, but. But it's the same logic that my feeling that I'm hungry or I'm aroused or I'm feeling altruistic and cooperative or I'm feeling angry and jealous. Think of jealousy as an emotion. The purpose of the evolutionary logic of jealousy is mate guarding, because we're not perfectly monogamous, and there's just enough infidelities that go on. You have to be fairly alert to your mate being poached by somebody else. So you become sensitive to little cues and things like this, right? And so that's an emotion that has a logic to it that comes from the bottom up through evolution. And all of the moral emotions are like that.
Here's the equivocation I think that's going on. I think there's a difference in how we use good. For example, we're sitting here at a chess table. There's a difference between making a move that's good, that helps me win some kind of game that we've made up. So if I go, if I turn my rook somewhere and I should have moved somewhere else, you checkmate me, I don't think the police is going to come and arrest me for making a bad move, right? I didn't do something immoral. I did something that wasn't wise, given the objective that we have set up in the game that we're playing. So in a relationship, you're totally right. If there's not trust, the relationship can't function. It's not a good move like in chess. But that's very different
within
than
the
a
board,
good,
within the boundary of the board. But if you had
moral
another
rule.
piece underneath the board and you snuck it up there when I turned away, that would be morally wrong. That's the difference between playing within the rules and violating the rules. So the rules, the guidelines, is what sets us up.
But these are just rules that we've made up. We can make up a rule that said if you want to pull in a rook and the other person doesn't see and catch you, then it's fine.
Okay, so
why can't we make up rules in the universe if there's not a moral lawgiver?
There is a certain amount of cultural variability. So I'll give you an example. I presume you think it's okay for Jews to be allowed into colleges in America now. Okay? This is fairly new.
I agree.
In the early 20th century, most Jews were not allowed in any colleges. And so why is it none of us think like this anymore? There's been a transition. And the transition is not the result of religion. In fact, the anti-Semitism by the founder of your religion, Martin Luther, was largely indistinguishable from the stuff Hitler would say.
I would reject him as the founder of my religion,
well,
but anyways,
Protestantism.
Go ahead.
Or take Henry VIII, who routinely had people beheaded and burned and so on.
We have other saints I would cling to a little bit more.
Well, okay, so I have a larger point that almost nobody would today, no Christian would accept much of the moral standards in the Old Testament, having to do with women and Jews and blacks and slaves and so on. We all reject that. Why is that? What happened? And so if presumably God laid down these moral values that were absolute and objective from on high 4,000 years ago, boom, there they are. And Moses writes them down in 1400 BC or whatever, and they're set in stone. Okay, but we don't obey those anymore. So what happened? Well, we've all progressed beyond that. And what we've done is expanded the circle of moral sentiments of who we're allowed to constitute as a member of our social group.
I would disagree with how it came about. I think Christians, especially things like slavery, played huge monumental roles
After the fact,
but
Christians had no problem for 1,500 years with slavery.
No, I think it's
practiced it. Everybody practiced
very,
it.
Very different way of looking at it.
And if you read the testimony of
historical question aside,
that's
debate
important
those.
Because if the moral values are true and absolute, and they were laid down in your holy book, then how come we don't obey most of those anymore?
Well, I actually think that's a different question. In the Old Testament, there were principles that were set down, and those moral principles have not changed. The practice of that principle, as society has moved over time, has in fact changed. So the principle of respect for life, the principle of honesty, the principle of chastity, etc., has not changed, although the expression of it has changed. Now, the difference is, as we look over history and say we've included the circle On an evolutionary worldview, we're just saying, well, this has changed. This is where things have evolved. Maybe we could evolve back the other way. It's not an improvement unless there's a standard outside of the evolutionary system saying this is actually better.
500 years ago, no Christian spoke out and said slavery was wrong. Nobody. This did not happen.
That doesn't matter.
This did not happen until the secular Enlightenment came along and said people have value in and of themselves. And then okay, I'll give you an example today.
All right, I hope you're having as much fun as I'm having.
I'll give you an example of a moral dilemma and controversy that's evolving right now. And here's my prediction.
All right.
Gay marriage. Okay, most Christians are against it. Some of the Episcopalian and more liberal theologians are in favor of it, but most evangelicals are absolutely dead set against it. Here's my prediction. Within 20 to 25 years, this will be all ancient history. Gays will be able to get married. It'll be no big deal. It won't have been a threat to heterosexual marriages. Christians will fully accept it. And then and Christians will take credit for it and say, that was our idea. Look at that Episcopalian minister who said gays should be able to get married. And that's exactly what happened with slavery.
No, I don't think that is what happened with slavery.
But are you against gay marriage, by the way?
You know what? The issue of same-sex marriage, we could come back to that. I don't think that's going to be a fruitful discussion for us right here.
But I assume you're against it because most evangelicals are. So the question is why? Because of that Old Testament scripture that says a man shall not sleep with a man, it's abomination. And I'm saying that you will dump that scripture within 20 years and no one will quote that anymore.
Whether I am for it or not, it has nothing to do with that Old Testament scripture. In
fact, but I'm saying it's objective moral value.
The fact that you point to that Old Testament scripture tells me that you're not understanding that scripture in the way that it was meant to be understood. That was for a particular society under a theocracy for a certain period of time.
Whoa, wait a minute. You said these came from on high, objective outside values.
Absolutely. The principles don't change, but the application of those principles can change because of society and because of where people were at. It doesn't make morality relative. It actually makes morality objectively true outside of us. So, whether or not Christians embrace slavery, I think is beside the point.
Well, they don't.
So, but they don't now. But even 500 years ago, and I don't think this is true. But say I conceded and said, all right, all Christians were in favor of it. It's still, we could just say, all right, they were hypocrites. That doesn't change the fact that you and I look back and say there's a standard of morality. That in the back, when whoever, secularists, skeptics, Christians, said this was okay, we know that was actually wrong.
Okay, but how do we know?
How do we know?
Yes,
Simple.
How do you know now?
We simply...
You can't get it from the holy book, so how do you know?
How do I know? I know the same way. We're back to the same point. I know the same way as you. We know by experience. We know by reflection. We know by intuition.
If we were born 500 years ago, you and I would not be saying we intuitively, instinctively, deeply know that slavery is wrong. We would not think that.
No, but you know what we would think? We would think that there still should be justice, there still should be mercy, there still should be morality, and then maybe people would differ about whether blacks qualified as individual persons, but we would still agree that the moral principle, you shouldn't enslave human beings, was objectively true. This is what Lewis pointed out in Mere Christianity. He said, we differ over the facts, but the objective moral truths have not changed.
Whether there's a God or not, we should do the right thing.